Continuing to track the brewing El Niño and some of the summer impacts we're already seeing. I'm ABC 10 Chief Meteorologist Monica Woods, and I want to start off with our sea surface temperature anomalies because they're already quite warm, especially along the equatorial Pacific and moving in through the eastern Pacific. Now, this is impacting our hurricane season so far. We've had now 7 named storms. One just got named, as opposed to the Atlantic Basin, where we've only had 2 named storms. This is exactly what we typically see in an El Nino year. So let's start off with Hurricane Fausto. This is the one that formed a couple days ago. Category 2 storm, just kind of churning its way through the Pacific, but the path is going to take it towards the Hawaiian Islands. This won't come until the middle of next week, and by the time we get to that point, it's very likely that becomes a tropical storm. So we'll watch the path of that. Certainly could still deal with a lot of wind and rain as well as flooding issues. So again, middle of next week is when we're going to be watching Fausto to head towards the Hawaiian Islands. Meantime, like I said, the Pacific really lighting up here for the hurricane season. We've got another storm potentially forming, about a 60% chance that's going to be a named storm. But just moments ago, we had a tropical storm that is now called Genevieve. It was a tropical depression just forming into that tropical storm strength. And this is a really interesting one because as it continues its movement towards those very warm waters, it's going to increase possibly to a Category 3 hurricane. Again, well off the coast, but what's interesting is its path moving more to the north here, still at a Category 2 by the middle of next week, 110-mile-per-hour winds. The last storm system that we were tracking that was kind of making a similar path was called Tropical Storm Alita. By the way, moved its way right up the Pacific into parts of the Pacific waters that was impacting parts of California, brought a lot of humidity as well as Sierra storms, which elevated the fire risk because we were concerned about lightning sparked fires. Didn't see too much of that, but certainly everyone was aware of the possibility of what that storm could bring. And then it's bringing that nice onshore flow right now. So it's still in play. Here we are nearly a week after that was a tropical storm. All right, let's take it back to El Nino and that southern oscillation. Now, typically, this is the pattern that we see. Trade winds typically move from the east over towards the west. And so it keeps kind of that warmer water bubbled way off to the west of the equatorial Pacific, away from Central America. But in El Nino years, those trade winds weaken and we see water getting pushed closer to the coast of South America. Why is that a big deal? Well, it has a lot of impacts, one for fishing industry, but it can also alter the storm track. And that's what we're looking at possibly through the winter season. Typical winter-like patterns during El Nino tends to favor a warmer than average weather pattern in much of the northern half of the country and then wetter through the southern half, except for this little bubble here through parts of the Midwest and the deep south. So we'll continue to monitor that. Again, that's deeper in the forecast. But this is the area that we watch in the equatorial Pacific. It's called Niño 3.4. Right now, temperatures are over 1 degree Celsius above normal and likely to go up from there. Again, the water's already getting pushed towards South America, and eventually this could have some impacts in California. 81% chance of a very strong El Nino October, November, and December. Some of those months tend to be our wettest months of the year in California, and so that's why we really have to be aware of possible El Nino impacts. Now, it's really interesting to see the evolution of the probabilities because just about a month ago, we were seeing some peaks and valleys here with La Nina, neutral, and El Nino. Look at this across the board. We are all El Nino from here on out, at least through possibly the upcoming spring. That was the latest outlook coming out of ENSO in July. We'll get another update the second Thursday of August. So the strength possibilities. And this is where we really start to hone in on the specifics of not just El Nino happening, but what's the strength going to look like. And it looks like the peak probability will be about an 81% chance of very strong El Nino, again, October, November, and December. But it's still in play here as we edge towards, again, our wettest months, December, January, and February. And that's where we start to get a bit more concerned because it's the accumulated impacts that we could see. But let's break it down because no 2 events are ever alike. But when we start to look at statistical averages, we can get an indication of things perhaps being amplified when a storm system starts to develop across the Pacific. So in Northern California, the breakdown of 11 events, including strong and very strong El Niños, 3 of those were wet, 5 were actually normal, and 3 were dry. So it's pretty much anything goes in Northern California. Things start to unfold a little bit more as we dig deeper into the south. Now, for the Sierra, obviously, the Sierra snowpack, a big concern for California. We get 30% of our entire water supply for the year out of that Sierra snowpack. So 3 of those years were wet, 4 normal, 4 dry. Don't love to see the dry part on that. And then for the Central Sierra, 6 were wet, 3 normal, and 2 were dry. So now we're starting to favor more of that wetter than average pattern, and that plays out as well in Southern California. The thing about Southern California is the capacity to hold that water is much, much lower than Northern California. And the risk of flooding goes up substantially when you start to get big events, big atmospheric rivers, big rain events happening in Southern California. And we've seen that time and time again, especially in El Niño years. As far as the drought monitor, do we need the rain? Well, we have drought every year. It's called summer because we don't get much in the way of rain. So here's where things stand, though, from the U.S. Drought Monitor. This, by the way, just came out the other day. 67 for the Drought Severity and Coverage Index. But in terms of what we're seeing, a little bit of pockets of severe drought starting to grow in the northwest corner of California. And again, 75% of the water supply comes from Northern California, but 75% of the need is in Southern California. Southern California actually did really well with this past water year, so that kind of tamped down some of the growing dryness. Our fire season, anytime we talk about drought, especially this time of year, it's what did the fuels look like? How dry are we? And we're playing out pretty much like we did last year, but keep in mind, 2025, 2026, the temperatures have largely been very similar, and the rain amounts as well. So it's kind of going hand in hand with our fire season. Plus, we've had a lot more prescribed burns going on because the weather conditions have been quite favorable to kind of get rid of some of the vulnerability in the foothills and in the mountains. The 5-year average is higher than what we've been seeing this year. We've had 3,800 plus fires, acres burned, just under 200,000 acres. Keep in mind, last year we had the Palisades and Eaton fires, so that really bumped up those numbers quite quickly. So all in all, fire season all year long, and this just happens to be the peak. Always preventing a spark is a good thing to keep in mind, especially after months of no rain in California. Keep vehicles off of dry grass, watch for dragging vehicle parts, mow lawns, not dry grass or weeds, and properly dispose cigarettes and matches. Again, the season is long because when you look at building a water year, we've already hit that 50% of our annual precipitation. Now we kind of are looking ahead to the next year. That's why we're talking a lot about El Niño. This is when the water is at its highest demands. We also have the monsoon season. It's not necessarily a direct impact in Southern California, but we get the feeder coming in from the desert Southwest. Plus, heat is a factor all the way deep in through September. As I mentioned, statewide precipitation since October 1st. By the way, the water year goes from October 1st of one year all the way into the following year, September 30th. And this year largely played out very favorable for Southern California with some flooding events that we had to deal with. But it's that northwest pocket right there around Eureka. And some of those basins were quite dry. And that's where we see kind of the growing dryness and drought. Reservoirs, obviously, is where we're going to hold all of our water, taking us through the dry part of the year. This is where things stand right now. We're anywhere from about 70 to 80% capacity, but this is the time of year that we're starting to drain those reservoirs because demand is at its highest and prepping for the season to come, which is really going to keep water managers' hands full, given that if a very strong El Niño continues to develop, they're really going to have to control the management here in those reservoirs. And as far as our averages, we're about 100 to over 100% of where we are normally this time of year. And again, same plays out, Central Sierra and parts of the Central Valley, about 60 to 87% full roughly, and over 100% of average. For most of those, Millerton, a little bit drier, 85% of average. All in all, things are looking good. Now, the flip side of things, temperatures. El Nino typically brings a bump up in temperatures, and that sets kind of the new global average. You can see the climb every time we have an El Nino year. That line goes up, 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 and so it's likely that we're going to be going into this year bumping up those temperatures. Summer so far, not horrible. Warmest highs so far for Sacramento, 104. That was actually just a couple days ago. July 14th and 15th is when we saw that. June 12th is going to be next in line at 102, and then we had a 101 on July 21st, June 13th, 197 on June 10th. So that's going to take our grand tally to 5 days so far this year in the 100s. Now, the peak heat, though, by the way, can last deep into the summer, even the beginning of the fall. September 5th and 6th is our hottest max temperature for Sacramento since 1995. That's when we hit 114. Hottest ever was on June 15th. So overall, our hottest months are July and August, but that doesn't mean the extremes are when we hit those peak temperatures. We've had 5 days, like I said, so far this year. 15 is the average, but given that we can still see really extreme heat in August and September, there's still a lot of time to do some catching up. As far as the past couple of years, I mentioned this just a second ago too, is that last year and this year playing out largely very similar. We've had a 5 days so far this year with 100+ degree heat, the hottest 104. Last year, we had the peak temperature at 103, but that was hit in August and September. That's why I always caution, okay, we've only had 5 days so far, but there's plenty of time to make up for that. 2024 was a scorcher, and our peak temperature was 110. We had over a dozen 100+ degree days, so it was really brutal and tough to deal with. Average highs are going to start to go into the downward territory here. Once we get into August, we start to see things cooling on average, but we can always see those extremes. The atmosphere is primed and ready to bump up those temperatures, and it's very likely we're going to head into a much warmer weather pattern to start off August. What I'm liking about some of the weather models, though, is it is showing just a brief bump up in temperatures, but the possibility of some monsoonal moisture working its way back into Southern California by the time we start off August as well. That falls in line with a growing high pressure ridge, which is going to pull up some of that moisture. So we'll also, by the way, have to watch Sierra storms in the forecast if that moisture makes it up the Sierra spine. Meantime, temperatures, as I mentioned, a very persistent weather pattern for the next several days, but it's at the end of that forecast that we start off the first weekend of August. Actually, the first 2 days of August will be in the 100s, and then we're starting to see temperatures fall again into the 90s. We'll be watching El Nino, and we'll be watching the heat.